At the end of 1942, the troops of Great Britain and the United States began military operations in North Africa, with landings on the coasts of Morocco and Algeria. The Axis forces tried to respond with reinforcements sent from Europe, but the terrain, Allied air control and logistical limitations complicated their position. At the beginning of 1943, the clashes moved toward the interior of Tunisia. The Allied offensives advanced from different directions, progressively closing the circle. The German resistance weakened as the divisions became separated or lost contact with their commands. In May, the main Axis units were surrounded and forced to surrender their weapons. A considerable number of German soldiers was detained in different points of the territory under British and American control. Many were unaware of their fate. They had fought for months in demanding conditions and were now placed in custody, awaiting orders. What would come next was outside of their calculations. What was it that they discovered in the United States that left thousands of German soldiers completely bewildered? Encircled in Tunis, the day the soldiers of the Reich surrendered their weapons. During the first months of 1943, the Axis forces stationed in North Africa faced a sudden shift in the balance of the conflict. What seemed like a prolonged campaign transformed into a desperate retreat. In the arid areas near Tunis, tens of thousands of German soldiers, exhausted and disorganized, found themselves surrounded by British and American forces. In barely a few days, the lines broke, the artillery ceased, and many officers lost contact with their superiors. Resistance became symbolic. As the fighting stopped, mass surrenders began. Complete units, some still in formation, emerged from improvised positions with their arms raised. Some marched with a firm step, others did so with their heads bowed, but everyone knew there was no turning back. At various points on the front, German officers handed over their service pistols to enemy commanders. It was the end of one stage and the beginning of another, completely uncertain one. The first to surrender were groups that had been trapped for weeks without supplies. Water and food reserves had been exhausted, and attempts at aerial resupply had failed. Those who resisted longer showed evident signs of exhaustion. Many were covered in dust, some wounded, others dehydrated. Even so, most retained a certain rigidity in their posture. They were still wearing their uniforms, although dirty and worn. Some still wore insignia, others had ripped them off before surrendering. At the Allied posts, the movement was constant. Trucks arrived and departed, transporting the newly captured to safer locations. In the first hours after the surrender, they were ordered to sit in rows while American soldiers took notes, checked documents, and counted the basic belongings they carried with them. Not everyone spoke English, and not all the interrogators spoke German, so gestures and simple commands became the norm. Raise your hands, empty your pockets, show your boots. Simple orders, but repeated without rest. Many of the prisoners feared the worst. Confused accounts circulated among them about immediate executions or inhumane punishments based on what they knew, or believed they knew, from other fronts. In the absence of concrete information, anxiety grew. No one said a word to them about their situation. The orders were terse, the gestures dry, and time moved forward between brief checks and moments of waiting that seemed to never end. In that void, fear took its own form. During those first hours of captivity, the soldiers began to talk amongst themselves. Some tried to calm the younger ones, others shared theories about what might happen. One said they would be sent to England, another assured they would end up in the desert as labor. No one had concrete information. In the groups, doubts arose about whether their families would know what had happened, if they would be registered by the Red Cross, or if any superior would still be giving orders. The chain of command was broken, and with it the sense of belonging. Some prisoners maintained their military demeanor. They lined up upon hearing an order or stood at attention before figures with rank. Others no longer showed interest in protocol. They sat on the ground, rested their heads on their backpacks, and closed their eyes. Resignation and uncertainty mingled on their faces. Not all came from the same type of unit. There were members of the Luftwaffe, of the Wehrmacht, even some from medical or logistical units. But at that moment, they were all just captives. The Allied soldiers, for their part, showed different attitudes. Some merely limited themselves to following orders. Others observed the newcomers with curiosity. It was the first time many of them had seen a German so closely without being under fire. Some talked amongst themselves while organizing the rows. They commented on the physical state of the prisoners, the increasing number of captured, or the stories they were hearing. The surprise was mutual. On more than one occasion, the prisoners observed the Allied equipment with attention. The boots, the watches, the belts, or the weapons seemed different to them. Some whispered that these details demonstrated the enemy's industrial capacity. Others tried to conceal their interest to avoid appearing vulnerable. Even so, every new detail reminded them that they were in the hands of a different power. As the hours passed, the rumors grew. No one knew for certain what would happen the next day. Some feared being separated from their comrades according to the rank or function they had held. Others preferred to think that everything would end soon and that it was a brief wait. Uncertainty settled into the routine, and conversations became more frequent, although many opted for silence and discreet observation. One detail that surprised several of the newly captured was the treatment. Although there was tension, no systematic abuse was reported. The Allied soldiers limited themselves to giving clear orders and maintaining order. Some prisoners expected shouting, blows, or humiliations, but these incidents were minimal. That unexpected calm further fueled the bewilderment. Some believed it was part of a strategy to disorient them, others began to relax. At certain moments, the German officers tried to communicate with their captors. They asked about the fate of their men or requested medical attention for the wounded. The responses were brief and formal. No one gave long explanations. Directions were pointed out, hand gestures were made, or phrases were repeated in English without translation. This language barrier fed the silence. During the nights, the groups were moved from one point to another within the same perimeter. They were not allowed to move freely. The guards walked with flashlights, checked rows, and took counts. In those hours, the prisoners spoke in low voices. Some tried to sleep on the ground, others simply waited. Time passed slowly. The body rested, but the mind remained active. Among the prisoners, there was a diversity of ages. Some were barely over 20 years old. Others already showed grey hair. In these initial moments, the differences faded. Everyone waited for the same thing, to know what would come next. War, which had been noise and fire, had transformed into waiting and silence. The dawn brought movement. New orders, new rows, new checks. Some received bread or water, while others were separated for medical reasons. The sequence of instructions marked the rhythm of the day without anyone explaining its purpose. In that environment, military functions lost relevance. They no longer operated as soldiers, nor as members of a hierarchical structure. They were individuals without command, under custody, fulfilling assigned tasks without knowing their purpose. The stage that had begun did not correspond to any known scheme. Sealed on the sea, the uncertain crossing of the German prisoners. Once separated from the front and concentrated at embarkation points under strict surveillance, the German prisoners began a journey they did not clearly anticipate. They were led in groups toward North African ports where the ships assigned for their transfer awaited them. Rumors circulated about various destinations. Some thought of England, others mentioned Canada or even a forced return to Germany. Nothing was confirmed, and the lack of concrete explanations allowed conjectures to circulate freely among the detainees. The vessels used for the ocean crossing were modified merchant ships, with no amenities or special preparations. Some had improvised bunks in holds that had previously been used for cargo. Others had sections delimited by metal barriers, without adequate ventilation or constant lighting. The first days aboard passed amidst a palpable tension, not only because of the bewilderment, but also due to the constant feeling of confinement and the uncertainty regarding the itinerary. Surveillance on deck was permanent, and any unauthorized movement provoked immediate reactions from the American soldiers in charge of the convoy's security. During the crossing, the convoys were accompanied by naval escorts. Frigates and destroyers surrounded the formation in changing patterns to avoid enemy attacks. The fear of German submarines was constant, and both prisoners and custodians were aware of the risk. In several voyages, alarms due to periscope sightings or torpedo signals interrupted the routine on board, forcing the crew to modify the course or adjust the speed. The Germans, confined in closed compartments, rarely received information about these events, although the hum of the propellers in sudden maneuvers or the changes in the hull's inclination made it clear that something was happening outside. The conditions inside the ships were basic. Overcrowding was common. Many slept on thin mattresses laid on the floor or on metal nets hung between beams. Limited ventilation produced a heavy atmosphere, especially in the deeper areas of the hull. The food rations were regular but scarce in variety. Dry bread, cold preserves, and some hot liquid formed the most frequent menu. Some prisoners commented among themselves that at least they received more food than during the last few days on the African front, although no one said it aloud. Potable water was rationed, and hygiene was reduced to brief opportunities to wash with buckets or in communal areas. Contacts with the North American soldiers on board were initial and brief, but they left clear impressions on both groups. The guards, with distinct uniforms and relaxed manners, drew attention due to unexpected details. Several prisoners were surprised to see African Americans among the escort personnel, something unusual in their previous experience. Also curious were the informal gestures of the custodians, their ways of speaking among themselves, and their manner of organizing surveillance tasks, very different from the rigidity to which they were accustomed in their own units. Despite the general silence and constant surveillance, small groups were allowed access to the deck at defined times. These brief outings served as the only respite from the prolonged confinement in the closed holds. For many, those minutes outdoors represented the only visual connection with the outside world during the entire voyage. The duration of the trip varied depending on the starting point, the sea conditions, and the route chosen to evade possible threats. Although most of the voyages lasted around 2 weeks, there were ships that remained on the high seas for more than 20 days. Security pauses or detours altered routines and confused the detainees even more. Without clocks or clear references, many lost track of the days, trying to keep improvised records on pieces of paper or discreetly marking the walls with whatever they had at hand. During the crossing, cultural differences began to be noticed more clearly. Some prisoners observed with astonishment the use that North American soldiers made of personal objects such as illustrated magazines, cigarettes of unknown brands, or beverages they could not identify. They also found the body language of their custodians curious, their way of organizing shifts or distributing orders. On more than one occasion, unplanned exchanges occurred. A kind gesture, a cigarette passed through a grate, a word shared between those who understood both languages. Although they were not permitted, these small moments marked some memories of the journey. The presence of wounded soldiers on some ships also drew the attention of the Germans. On certain vessels, medical compartments had been set up where Americans injured on the African front were being transported. The physical proximity between prisoners and convalescent soldiers caused scenes of forced silence. Conversations or prolonged glances were not allowed, but the noises, complaints, or nocturnal groans of the wounded broke the usual routine. This involuntary coexistence evidenced, without words, the consequences of the conflict from different perspectives. The security protocol required constant inspections. Every compartment where the prisoners were located was inspected several times a day. The searches included visual checks, individual counts, and verification of possible unauthorized objects. The Germans, without means to communicate with the outside world, merely waited for instructions. Contact with the rest of the world was reduced to the horizon visible from a porthole or to the sounds arriving from the deck. In some convoys, basic routines were organized to maintain order, rest schedules, brief walks in delimited areas, and even spaces designated for collective prayers. These latter activities were permitted if requested and supervised, although they were not implemented on all ships. Music, on the other hand, was almost non-existent. On few occasions, melodies were heard coming from the American crew, played on portable radios. For the prisoners, these sounds were alien, fragments of an environment they could not yet comprehend. The disembarkation, first impressions of America. After weeks on the high seas, the German prisoners finally caught sight of the outline of the American coast. For many, this moment marked the first time they had seen the North American continent, an image that contrasted with everything they knew. As the ships approached ports like Norfolk, New York, or Newport News, the men observed from the decks the docks full of cranes, warehouses, and constantly moving cargo ships. These port scenarios, full of machinery and workers, provided a first glimpse of the size and economic activity of the country receiving them into custody. The majority of the newcomers had not had direct contact with cities of comparable size. The German cities, many already damaged by bombings, did not offer the same pace, nor the intact appearance presented by the American cities. From the first disembarkation, many of the captives began to comment among themselves on the size of the buildings, the speed of the vehicles passing near the port, and the organization of the industrial spaces. There were no explanations from the guards. Nevertheless, the landscape spoke for itself. Once disembarked, the prisoners were formed into groups and led under surveillance toward trains that were already prepared for the transfer into the interior of the country. The logistics of this operation showed large-scale coordination. Without delays or apparent confusion, each group was escorted by armed soldiers to the cars that awaited them with metallic sliding doors, side benches, and restricted ventilation. Despite the discomfort of the space, the transfer by rail allowed the prisoners an opportunity to observe, through the small openings, parts of the country that were unknown to them. The railway journey crossed areas that combined rural landscapes, industrial areas, and urban centers of varying sizes. Through the windows, the detained soldiers saw vast fields, well-maintained wooden houses, stations with clear signage, and towns with structures that differed in design and distribution from those they knew in Europe. Although the cars did not stop at these points, the English names written in large letters were easily visible and gave an idea of the country's extent. During the first hours of the journey, silence predominated among the detainees. As the miles passed, some began to exchange brief observations, especially about the quality of the railroad. The tracks seemed firm, the rails well-maintained, and the locomotives operated without interruptions. The constant sound of the train advancing, coupled with the passing over bridges, tunnels, and slopes, gradually set the pace of the trip, while the prisoners tried to identify some pattern in what they were seeing. The image of the country's interior was not limited to a single area. Some trains took routes south, others west or toward the Midwest. Therefore, impressions varied slightly according to the itinerary. In general, the areas they crossed presented an orderly appearance, without visible signs of destruction or extreme poverty. The fields seemed well cultivated, the roads in good condition, and occasionally moving trucks could be seen, even tractors operating near the railway. Despite the strict control exerted by the custodians, many prisoners could not avoid closely observing the urban landscape every time the train crossed inhabited areas. Some tall buildings, well-lit stations, and streets with movement hinted at a level of activity they did not expect. Although there was no contact with the population, hands were raised in a gesture of greeting from some balconies or platforms. This distant but peaceful reaction disconcerted several of the prisoners, accustomed to imagining a reception marked by rejection or humiliation. The contrast with the images that had been transmitted to them during the war was evident. An unorganized country was expected, lacking preparation, with little infrastructure. However, what they saw from the cars contradicted that image. The stations were clean, the railway personnel wore complete uniforms, and tasks observed during technical stops were carried out with efficiency. Although direct contact was minimal, the environment conveyed an impression of high operational capacity. Throughout the entire journey, the American soldiers in charge of the transport maintained a firm attitude, without excesses or displays of cruelty. They limited themselves to checking the compartments, counting the prisoners, and ensuring that no incidents occurred. The language barrier prevented deeper exchanges, but some detainees began to take note of certain gestures, tones of voice, or ways of acting that differed from what they had experienced in their own units. This first indirect human contact with the American military population showed a new level of bewilderment. The natural landscape also did not go unnoticed. From tree-covered hills to large sown plains, everything seemed vast, well-maintained and utilized. In certain stretches, the train bordered rivers or crossed viaducts that offered open views of the terrain. That vastness, added to the visible dynamism at every passing point, created a portrait of a country that, at least from outside the car, showed no visible signs of fatigue from the ongoing war. The constant noise of the train, coupled with the changing scenarios, contributed to a mental state of continuous observation. Some prisoners tried to calculate the distance traveled based on time and perceived speed, although they lacked clear references. Others tried to recall the names of the towns or associate what they were seeing with what they had heard in previous propaganda. In this effort to understand what they were witnessing, a type of attention developed that was not typical of their previous transfers as soldiers. When the convoys crossed busy railway areas, the prisoners attentively watched the trains passing in the opposite direction. Freight cars, military units or civilian formations continued their course without interruption. Some tried to imagine where they were headed or what they were transporting. The scene, viewed from the windows, left a persistent impression of dynamism. That suggested a country that kept its activity going even in wartime. The end of the journey was not announced in advance. Suddenly, the train slowed down, entered a secondary track, and stopped at a point where the prisoners were called to disembark. At that moment, under the constant surveillance of the escorts, the groups that would be transferred to the next destination were formed again. The landscape, despite changing, maintained the same orderly appearance, with no visible signs of improvisation. For those who had been captured in desert areas, crossed the sea, and traversed half a continent on trains that did not fail, the arrival on solid ground in the United States marked a key point. They did not know what would come next or how they would be treated. However, what they had already seen had forced them to adjust many of their previous ideas about the country that now held them under control. And that confrontation between what they expected and what they saw during the trip marked a difference that they would not easily forget. Between fences and routines, this was life in the prisoner of war camps. Upon their arrival on American soil, the German prisoners were distributed throughout different regions of the country, housed in camps specially built to keep them under surveillance, but also to ensure basic conditions of organization and routine. Although custody remained rigorous, the spaces did not evoke scenes of punishment or extreme overcrowding. Unlike other wars, where the captured were locked up in improvised cells, this time complete and permanent installations had been erected, with spacious barracks, delimited areas, and structures that could house hundreds of men simultaneously. Each enclosure was surrounded by high fences with several lines of wire, watchtowers with armed soldiers, and clearly restricted zones. Despite this perimeter system, the interior showed an orderly distribution. The common areas were divided into dormitories, administrative zones, workshops, recreational spaces, and meeting rooms. The barracks were simple constructions, quickly erected but designed to withstand daily use. They were equipped with aligned beds, generally two-tiered bunks, where each prisoner had one blanket, a basic mattress, and space to place their belongings. The hygiene conditions were rudimentary, but not completely neglected. Separate facilities existed for washing, with cold or lukewarm water showers and sinks distributed by modules. Time inside the camp was governed by strict schedules. The day began with a reveille, followed by morning formations where the internees had to line up to be counted. Precision in these counts was a priority, as any incorrect number activated an immediate review and isolation protocol. Subsequently, the prisoners were released to perform internal tasks, voluntary activities, or simply remain in their designated zones. There was a fixed schedule for cleaning, maintenance, and organization of the environment. Those who showed disposition or ability for technical jobs could be assigned to specific tasks, such as carpentry, furniture repair, or the crafting of minor items. Although it was not formal employment, an internal structure existed that facilitated an established routine. In some cases, the German soldiers were grouped by unit of origin or even by hometown, which allowed them to retain a sense of familiarity. However, this was not applied in all centers. Some camps opted to randomly reorganize the prisoners to prevent the formation of internal hierarchies or the maintenance of overly solid loyalty ties. The American military authorities were careful to avoid any type of parallel structure that could generate tension within the camp. The behavior of the guards was generally methodical. They were American soldiers specifically assigned to the custody of the prisoners of war. These guards were instructed in protocols that combined firmness with respect for international norms. There was no unnecessary contact, nor space for personal dialogues. Orders were transmitted by signals, signs, or formal instructions. In some camps, the more veteran soldiers were in charge of establishing the internal rules, with authorization from the military leaders. Thus, codes of behavior arose among the prisoners themselves, regulating details such as the cleaning of common areas, bathing shifts, or the shared use of materials. As the weeks went by, activities to occupy the free time emerged. Sport was one of the main release valves. Fields for soccer, running areas, or improvised volleyball courts were set up. The prisoners formed teams, organized matches by barracks, and maintained an informal competition calendar. These activities not only helped maintain physical fitness, but also allowed for the reduction of tensions and the establishment of coexistence routines. Besides sport, some opted to organize music groups, theatrical performances, or collective readings. Access to instruments was limited, but on occasion the entry of guitars, harmonicas, or rudimentary drums was permitted. Another way of occupation was education. In several camps, improvised classes in languages, mathematics, or history were organized. Some prisoners with previous academic training offered lessons to their comrades. Wooden blackboards, recycled notebooks, and books that arrived through humanitarian associations were used. In this context, the teaching did not have an ideological purpose, but rather a practical one, to fill time and keep mental skills active. Communications with the outside world were controlled by an authorized correspondence system. Each prisoner could write letters to his family in Germany, always within defined limits. The content had to be specific, avoiding military references, political criticism, or sensitive information. These letters went through censorship filters both in the United States and in Europe, and in many cases took weeks or even months to arrive. Despite this, they were one of the few ways the prisoners had to confirm they were still alive, learn basic news of their relatives, or send small personal messages. The sending of photographs was regulated, but in some cases the inclusion of small black and white portraits was permitted. The replies from Germany also arrived under review, with parts removed or crossed out when they did not comply with the restrictions. The distribution of the mail was carried out publicly. When a package or a letter arrived at a camp, the corresponding officer would read the recipient's name aloud. The prisoner had to step forward, sign a proof of receipt, and could then read the message in his space. Some shared the news received with others, especially if it brought general updates on the situation in their hometowns. Others preferred to remain silent and preserve the privacy of what was written. In both cases, the letters were a tangible reminder that the outside world continued to exist. Each camp had its own internal regulations, but they shared common principles. It was forbidden to leave the fenced area, hide unregistered objects, or assault the guards. Infractions were punished with temporary isolation, loss of certain privileges, or transfer to camps with more severe measures. In specific situations, punishment spaces were used, consisting of individual barracks with constant surveillance. These measures, although firm, were presented as corrective and not as reprisals. The intention was to maintain control without generating unnecessary conflicts. The organizational system also included internal committees. Some groups of prisoners formed representations to raise requests or resolve minor disputes. These committees did not have official power, but they were tolerated as self-regulation tools. This is how problems such as the use of showers, shared cleaning, or access to materials were managed. In specific cases, the leaders of these groups could send notes to the officers in charge requesting specific changes or permissions. A significant part of the daily routine went unnoticed from the outside, but marked the individual experience. Time passed between walks within the perimeter, conversations among acquaintances, card games, or improvised reading sessions. Prisoners with knowledge in carpentry, sewing, or object repair usually put their skills at the service of the rest. Broken chairs were repaired, worn-out uniforms were adjusted, and handcrafted objects were made to occupy the time. Visual contact with the guards was scarce. The watchtowers maintained a constant presence, but the soldiers in charge rarely interacted with the internees. Only when there were general instructions or emergencies was any kind of direct dialogue established. In most cases, the relationship was distant, based solely on surveillance. The weather marked the day's activities. In hot areas, physical exercises were done early or at dusk. In cold places, indoor spaces were sought to pass the time. Some camps had simple stoves, and extra blankets were distributed during the winter, although the cold still bothered many. In more temperate regions, the hardest thing was enduring the humidity or the heat inside the barracks. The days resembled each other. The sound of the réveillé, the formation, the scheduled tasks, and the rest routines formed a constant cycle. The lack of variation caused the prisoners to measure the passing of time based on small events, the arrival of the mail, the start of an internal sports league, or the change of season. Despite the limited environment, basic forms of cultural organization emerged. In some camps, significant dates were celebrated discreetly. Without great symbols or elaborate rituals, personal anniversaries, religious celebrations, or national commemorations were observed. These activities were carried out with prior permission and under supervision, always respecting the limits of the environment. In practice, life behind the barbed wire fences transpired between repeated tasks, strict rules, and moments of restricted leisure. There was no clear horizon or indication of when the confinement would end. The prisoners spent their days within a defined scheme, with visible limits and delimited functions. Although the uncertainty persisted, the environment imposed a rhythm that over time became predictable. They ate better than in Germany, the diet nobody expected in captivity. The food received by the German prisoners in the camps located within the United States became one of the most shocking elements of their experience behind the barbed wire fences. The provision system managed by the American Army made no distinction between nationalities when applying the established standards. Through a strictly regulated structure, the detained men received menus designed in accordance with the host country's own military regulations. This meant daily access to products that had been scarce in Europe for years. Meat, white bread, desserts, fruits, coffee and milk were distributed in sufficient quantities to maintain the physical condition of the detainees as deemed by the authorities. In multiple statements and records, soldiers of the Third Reich expressed perplexedness by the type of food they began receiving shortly after their arrival. Most of them had endured dwindling rations in North Africa, followed by days or weeks of transit, which made the contrast even more shocking. For many, it was the first time in a long time that they ate until they were full. The soft sliced bread, the portions of cooked or canned meat, the whole pieces of fruit, and the access to butter or jams generated a combination of surprise, skepticism, and silent gratitude. Some were initially suspicious, believing it was a strategy to disorient or manipulate them, although they soon came to assume that this diet corresponded to the ordinary routine of those who lived in the country. The camp kitchens operated as well-organized units, supplied through state contracts. Logistic control allowed for the delivery of fresh and processed ingredients to each facility without relying on local resources. Each camp had cooks and personnel responsible for supervising that the rations were distributed equitably. A constant point of comparison was the food situation in Germany. Letters arriving from Europe, although subject to censorship, reported a widespread scarcity. Entire families were surviving on reduced portions, artificial substitutes, and rationed foods. In contrast, the prisoners received regular portions of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Many were surprised to find that even in a condition of confinement, they could access more varied and nutritious food than their free relatives on the other side of the Atlantic. Meat constituted one of the most notable products. In Germany, access to animal proteins had become extremely limited as the war progressed. In the United States, however, it was common for dishes with beef, pork, or poultry to be served frequently. Despite the adjustments caused by the war effort, the country maintained an internal supply chain capable of feeding its civilian population and the armed forces, including the captives. Reactions among the prisoners ranged from contained satisfaction to complete bewilderment. For many, it was difficult to assimilate that a nation at war could guarantee abundant food even to its captured enemies. The bread also provoked comments. The soft texture, sweet flavor, and white color of the slices contrasted with the dark and more compact bread to which they were accustomed. Some considered it too soft or lacking in flavor, although they accepted it without major objections. They became accustomed to combining it with jams or butter when available. Other items such as flaked cereals, pasteurized milk, or canned fruits were strange for those who came from a food culture focused on less industrialized products. Nevertheless, in general, the adaptation was quick and without incidents. Regarding sweets, their availability was one of the most recurring surprises. Chocolates, cookies, cakes, and sugared fruits appeared on the menus frequently, especially on significant dates or to lift the spirits of the internees. Although not all the detainees were enthusiastic about these foods, the majority consumed them with interest. For those who had been facing rationings for years, this type of product represented a tangible display of the country's abundance. The beverages also marked a difference. Coffee, served regularly, generated a combination of enthusiasm and bewilderment. Accustomed to barley coffee or diluted versions, many found it strong or bitter, although preferable to the alternatives they knew. Milk, both liquid and powdered, was also offered frequently, and even though some rejected it out of habit or preference, it ended up being a stable part of the daily consumption in the camps. The structures that allowed for maintaining this level of sustenance were not limited to the kitchens. Behind every menu existed a well-managed network of production, transport, and storage. Railway routes delivered products from logistical centres to each camp, and there was a daily record of what entered and left the warehouses. Sanitary inspections were routine, and quality controls were carried out on the prepared food. Although there were isolated complaints about the temperature, presentation, or flavour of certain meals, in general terms the prisoners did not go hungry. Regular access to hot, varied, and sufficient quantity meals solidified an image of efficiency and predictability. This treatment was not applied out of spontaneous generosity, but because the rules of the Geneva Convention obliged the signatory countries to adequately feed captured soldiers. However, the strict compliance with those obligations was not always observed in the theatres of war on other continents. The fidelity of the United States to those agreements surprised more than one prisoner, especially when they compared their experience with what they knew about German or Soviet prisoner camps. The difference was not only in the quantity, but also in the system that ensured that the supply would never be interrupted. The variety of foods allowed the cooks to improvise within the margins of the regulation. In some camps, certain dishes were adapted to approach the tastes of the prisoners, while in others, a standard structure was maintained for all. Although it was not possible to replicate traditional German cuisine, combinations that resulted familiar were attempted, such as stews with potatoes or soups with legumes. The kitchens had industrial utensils, ovens, refrigerators, and trained personnel, which allowed for large-scale production without loss of efficiency. The reaction to this diet was not limited to the physical level. As the weeks passed, many detainees began to realize that what they saw on their trays was part of the daily life of the inhabitants of the country that had captured them. That realization fueled, without explicit intention, a perception about the economic power of the enemy. Without speeches or proclamations, the rations served 3 times a day spoke for themselves. The fact that even the prisoners received a constant, predictable, and abundant food treatment served as a contrast to the visible deterioration suffered by their families and compatriots in Europe. The contact with little-known products also incentivized curiosity. Some prisoners asked for the names of certain ingredients, inquired about the origin of the fruits, or speculated about the production processes. Although not all the foods were to the general liking, most were accepted without protest. Only on rare occasions were episodes of organized rejection or strikes linked to food recorded, and those situations almost always had to do with causes unrelated to the quality of the menu. In general, the testimonies collected in reports, personal diaries, or later declarations confirm that the food received widely surpassed initial expectations. Even those who were skeptical or distrustful at first ended up accepting that they were living an extraordinary situation. Food, without requiring propaganda or direct intervention, became one of the most compelling pieces of evidence of the material distance between both worlds. While the conflict continued in Europe and Asia in the American camps, food acquired an unexpected value. The trays arrived with sufficient, varied, and better presented rations than many would have imagined for prisoners of war. For some, it was the first time in years they could eat without fear of immediate scarcity. That daily gesture calmed hunger, but also caused confusion. It was difficult to assimilate that, even in captivity, it was possible to receive more food than many families in Germany. Re-educating the enemy, the war of ideas. From the moment American authorities began receiving a large number of German prisoners on their territory, a concern arose that went beyond physical surveillance or the management of their camps. The political and military leadership in Washington saw an opportunity. If those soldiers, mostly formed under years of National Socialist propaganda, were exposed to other frameworks of thought, perhaps they could return to Europe with a different mindset. With that idea, educational initiatives were designed within the enclosures where they were held. The general objective was not limited to neutralizing possible internal threats or avoiding ideological tensions. It was about facilitating, through structured methods, the prisoners' direct contact with the political and social values of the United States. For some sectors of the government, the effort also offered a way to test cultural reconstruction strategies in post-war Germany. Unlike conventional military surveillance, this required pedagogical planning, a meticulous selection of content, and an adapted infrastructure to educate the internees without violating international norms regarding the treatment of captives. One of the main axes of the program was the creation of specialized centers within certain camps. These spaces were not open to any prisoner. Only those who showed a predisposition to participate voluntarily in intellectual activities and whose disciplinary record did not include recent incidents were admitted. The selection interviews were carried out by officers with training in social sciences, many of them bilingual, who sought to identify signs of openness to change beyond the individual's previous level of instruction. Once accepted, the prisoners had access to a regular schedule of informative sessions and reading cycles. Classes were taught by civilian educators, mostly university professors who collaborated temporarily with the army. Priority was given to topics related to parliamentary systems, division of powers, basic notions of modern constitutions, and the functioning of free media. In the classrooms, a structure with fixed schedules, attendance lists, and printed materials specially prepared for that context was respected. In addition to the classes, each of these centers had a library. The catalogue included books translated into German that addressed contemporary history, market economics, universal literature, and biographies of influential figures in Western democracies. Access to the material was controlled, but no obligatory titles were imposed. The internees could borrow the books for several hours and, in some cases, request copies to study in their barracks. The management of the volumes was the responsibility of other prisoners previously trained as internal librarians. Another key tool was the incorporation of news bulletins prepared in German, distributed regularly in different camps. These pamphlets, approved by the Office of Psychological Warfare, included articles about international events, analysis of the conflict from a non-nationalistic perspective, and edited interviews with German exiles or public figures critical of the Nazi regime. Although not all the captives showed interest in these texts, the authorities noticed a sustained increase in their reading, especially among those who had participated in the formal educational programs. In parallel, discussion forums moderated by instructors were organized. In these meetings, small groups of prisoners debated previously selected topics. The format consisted of brief presentations, followed by controlled verbal exchanges, where argumentative expression was promoted, without aggression or impositions. Some of these encounters derived into writing exercises where the participants had to synthesize their ideas in writing, which also served to evaluate their comprehension of the presented concepts. As the program advanced, differences in attitude emerged among the prisoners. A significant portion maintained a defensive or skeptical posture towards the proposals. However, another more receptive sector began to show changes in tone in their daily conversations, greater willingness to collaborate in internal tasks, and a growing interest in understanding the North American social model. These signs were collected in periodic reports prepared by the civilian supervisors of the program. The monitoring of results included anonymous questionnaires, follow-up interviews, and the direct observation of behaviors inside and outside the classroom. Although the figures did not show immediate transformations in all cases, they did reflect a progressive change in certain patterns of thought. The reading of international press in German and the use of more elaborate arguments in discussions were seen as signs of progress. In some centers, listening stations with radios configured to pick up German transmissions from foreign stations were set up. These sessions were controlled and carried out in small groups, accompanied by guided commentary to facilitate comprehension. Through them, the prisoners could access versions of the conflict different from those disseminated by the propaganda of the regime they had served. This contact with other approaches partially strengthened the pedagogical function of the general program. Attempts to replicate, within the camp, common practices in democratic systems were also recorded. Internal committees with limited functions were formed, such as the organization of sporting events, the coordination of voluntary tasks, or the supervision of the shifts in the library. Although their attributions were restricted, they allowed some internees to put into practice basic forms of collective organization and shared responsibility without rigid military hierarchies. The American military authorities maintained strict control over the evolution of the program. No content that could be interpreted as direct propaganda was allowed, nor were public manifestations in favor of specific political figures accepted. The focus remained within the limits of cultural exchange and the presentation of ideological alternatives without explicit coercion or imposition. Neutrality was one of the key principles to avoid tensions with other international bodies or with the military command itself. The program, which was developed mainly between 1944 and 1945, had different degrees of implementation depending on the region and the number of captives. Not all camps had educational centers, nor were all prisoners exposed to these initiatives. However, the results obtained in those places where it was applied allowed those in charge of the design to draw useful conclusions for subsequent plans for cultural reconstruction in Europe. Factories that never stopped when they saw what America was capable of. When the German soldiers were transferred to factory installations within United States territory, they found themselves immersed in an environment of mass production that surpassed all previous references. What most caught their attention was not the size of the buildings, but the constant and calculated rhythm of the industrial work. From the synchronized movement of materials to the precise coordination of the operators, everything seemed to respond to an implacable logic of technical efficiency. It was not just a factory. It was a perfectly geared system, where each phase of the process fulfilled a measurable and controlled function. One of the factories that most surprised the observers was the Willow Run plant, built to assemble military aircraft in an environment adapted to the assembly line work model. It was a structure designed to accelerate the production of B-24 bombers, with a logic that combined engineering, efficiency, and time utilization. This plant was not an expansion of some previous installation, but a specific construction that responded to the objective of manufacturing in mass with a regularity that defied all comparison with the European industry of the moment. Willow Run occupied a plot of hundreds of hectares. Each section of the complex had a clear purpose. Raw materials arrived at one end, were treated, cut, molded, and assembled in a continuous sequence until the planes came out ready to fly. The use of standardized tools, the arrangement of the operators in perfectly defined rows, and the constant supervision of the working time created a sustained rhythm that hardly ever stopped. The Detroit environment served as a generalized example of what was experienced in many industrial cities of the United States. The streets were full of vehicles that were not only personal automobiles, one also saw transport trucks, delivery vans, buses, and military units. The noise of engines, hammers, cranes, and chains could be heard at any hour. Steel, rubber, electricity, and steam were part of the day-to-day. Production covered multiple sectors where thousands of people participated, from engineers to operators, drivers, supervisors, and maintenance technicians. The Ford Company, one of the most visible in that scheme, had modified its assembly lines to adapt them to the war demand. Although its name had been linked for decades to the development of automobiles, in that period each section of the company was oriented toward a distinct function. Manufacturing of mechanical parts, assembly of aeronautical components, verification of electrical systems, testing of engines, or adjustment of special bodywork. The result was a sequence of chained tasks that allowed for obtaining finished products in a reduced time. The standardization of procedures was another element that caught their attention. Each worker knew exactly what to do, when, and with what tools. There was no need to improvise or wait for constant instructions. Tasks were divided by specialty and schedule, and any delay could be detected and corrected quickly. That logic was maintained in aviation factories, ammunition plants, repair trains, or port areas. Besides production, logistics had a solid structure. Parts were transported between cities on cargo trains, articulated trucks, or deep-draft ships. The depots functioned as exchange nodes, where parts were temporarily stored before being sent to their final destination. This network facilitated production and guaranteed a constant flow of inputs, which allowed the rhythm to be maintained without interruptions. On more than one occasion, certain groups of prisoners were driven through areas close to factory complexes as part of the logistical process. During these transfers, they observed directly the extent and scale of the installations. The constructions were aligned without interruption, with metal hangars, high ceilings, wide accesses, loading stations, and organized platforms. The environment transmitted a sensation of structural solidity and detailed planning, very different from what they remembered of their own industrial cities. Another aspect that stood out was the number of people involved. The productive effort did not fall on a technical elite, but included a large quantity of citizens. Men and women, young and adults, fulfilled functions in different shifts. Some operated heavy machinery, others controlled the entry and exit of materials, while others were dedicated to inspecting the final products. This collective participation in the productive system showed a model that prioritized continuity and response capacity. The relationship between speed and volume was also difficult to process. In a span of 24 hours, multiple units of the same model could be assembled, something that in other contexts could take weeks. The detailed planning, the availability of resources, and the technical division of labor achieved that the process advanced with a predictable regularity. Trains were another essential component in this mechanism. They not only served to transport goods, they were also used to mobilize people, coordinate deliveries, and supply strategic points. The railway system was composed of modern locomotives, specialized wagons, intermediate stations, and well-maintained routes. Punctuality, safety, and load capacity were variables that were taken into account rigorously. For those who came from regions where the infrastructure had been destroyed or neglected, that level of operability was unprecedented. At certain points, it was possible to observe munition factories working non-stop, military vehicle plants in full activity, or assembly centers for heavy artillery. Each of these spaces had precise tools, control systems, and trained operators. Technical supervision, quality control, and resource optimization were part of the usual process. No empty areas or wasted resources were observed. Each section fulfilled a measured purpose. A constant connection between industry and communication was also noted. The factories were linked through telephone lines, telegrams, or written dispatches. Any change in orders or deadlines could be transmitted in real time, and decisions were adjusted immediately. That fluidity in the transmission of information allowed for correcting errors, anticipating needs, and reorganizing processes without delays. This interaction reinforced the system's efficiency. In some urban areas, the industrial complexes extended for several kilometers, with restricted access zones, inspection stations, metal barriers, and internal roads. Activities included vehicle maintenance, weapon verification, resistance tests, or installation of auxiliary systems. All of this was part of a continuous cycle that kept the country in motion. From the perspective of the forced observers, that framework of structures, resources, and people functioning continuously marked an unavoidable difference from what they knew. In their cities of origin, many factories lay in ruins. Others survived with dispersed operators and irregular shifts, overwhelmed by the scarcity of materials and personnel. Here, in contrast, every gear seemed to occupy its place. The comparison was not imagined. It arose from what they saw with their own eyes, without the need for translations or speeches. The example of the Ford plant was mentioned frequently, although it was not exclusive. Several companies, large and medium-sized, had adapted to the demands of the conflict. Some manufactured heavy vehicles, others produced communication equipment or uniforms, and others assembled parts destined for ships or planes. Each company was inserted into a larger network that responded to goals defined by the government and the army high commands. This level of coordination was visible in all stages of the process. They returned different, what the repatriated prisoners carried in their heads. Upon the conclusion of the conflict, the Allied governments began to define the procedures for returning the German prisoners who were in United States territory. The repatriation of tens of thousands of soldiers required detailed logistics and prolonged planning. The first groups were selected by specific criteria that considered both the antiquity of their capture and their state of health. Those who had shown collaborative behavior during their stay were placed on the initial lists. The transfers towards Europe were carried out in stages. The prisoners were transported to ports on the East Coast, where they awaited embarkation towards different points on the continent. The journeys were extensive, and the conditions varied according to the moment and the capacity of each vessel. Upon arriving in Europe, not all were sent directly to their regions of origin. Many passed through transit centers, where their identity was verified and their background was evaluated. During the return trip, comments about what was experienced in the United States were frequent. Some discussed the facilities they had known, others remembered conversations, educational sessions, or even debates in which they participated. The experience had been different from what they imagined when they were captured. The descriptions they shared reflected a mixture of surprise, detachment, and a certain form of respect for the environment in which they remained for years. The most noteworthy impact occurred once they set foot on German soil. What they found was different from what they had left behind. Many cities were partially destroyed, the infrastructure was deteriorated, and economic activity was barely beginning to reorganize. Family ties had been altered, and the values that previously governed their society were under review. In that new context, the ex-prisoners arrived with a perception formed in foreign environments. One of the aspects that was most commented upon returning was how life was lived inside the camps. Some spoke of spaces where they could read, others remembered concrete moments linked to certain activities or internal dynamics. Each story had its own tone. There were those who mentioned it as just another routine, and others described it in more detail. In any case, those comments began to arouse curiosity among those who were hearing them for the first time. In rural areas, where external information arrived slowly, those testimonies gained greater weight. The figure of the repatriated prisoner began to occupy a particular space. It was not only someone who was returning, but a person who had been exposed to another way of organizing collective life. Although many avoided issuing judgments, the mere description of their routines generated silent comparisons with the environment in which they were now living. A reduced number participated in activities linked to institutional reconstruction. Some were assigned to civil registries, others joined local tasks of assistance and community organization. In these functions, the central point was not to reproduce what was learned in captivity, but to respond to the immediate urgencies of towns and cities damaged by the war. The previous experience in the American camps was reflected only indirectly, in the form of proposing practical solutions or in the willingness to collaborate with a civil order that needed to be rebuilt from the base. The Allied occupation authorities observed this phenomenon with interest. Reports prepared by different dependencies registered the attitude of the ex-prisoners upon returning, their level of social participation, and the contents they shared in their environments. A group of ex-combatants was identified who, without adopting an open political stance, promoted forms of coexistence that were more structured. That did not imply a complete transformation, but it showed a willingness to assume certain practices seen abroad. With the passage of time, the memory of their stay in the camps became part of the family memory. In some houses, anecdotes related to the tasks they performed, the languages they heard, or the informative programs they tuned into were mentioned. In others, silence predominated. Not all wanted to remember that stage. However, even in those cases, the passage through the United States left marks on the way they interpreted the subsequent reality. In educational and cultural institutions, some ex-prisoners offered talks or participated in activities that sought to reconstruct the recent past. They were not frequent speakers, but their presence was considered valuable. The testimony of those who had lived in an environment controlled by a foreign power was relevant to understanding the changes of the post-war era. Their stories allowed for contrasting local narratives with direct experiences. The adaptation process was not uniform. There were those who integrated quickly, resumed previous trades, and maintained a low profile. Others faced difficulties, whether due to economic conditions or the social perception regarding their past. In certain cases, they were questioned for having spent several years in an environment with different conditions, as if that made them less connected to the common experiences of the rest of the population. Even so, the majority managed to find a place from which to rebuild their bonds. Official archives preserve correspondence, reports, and interviews that document this stage. Some testimonies highlight the contrast between the organization of public spaces in the United States and the situation they faced upon returning. Aspects such as the punctuality of services, the maintenance of infrastructures, or access to cultural products are mentioned. These comparisons were not always favorable to their country of origin, although they were formulated with prudent language. The deepest transformation was not limited to external aspects. For many, the stay in another country for such a prolonged period modified the way they related to others, interpreted the role of authority, or understood the value of certain rights. These ideas were not always expressed openly, but they manifested in small decisions, gestures, or comments. With the passage of the years, the repatriated prisoners ceased to be a differentiated category. They integrated into daily life, formed families, worked in different sectors, and participated in the reconstruction of the country. Their experiences became part of the private history of each community. However, in subsequent studies, several researchers pointed out that the prolonged exposure to another culture had contributed to broadening the perspective of a segment of the population. In the records of historians and sociologists, that influence does not appear as a central element, but its presence is recognized. There is talk of a particular way of observing the public sphere, an interest in the functioning of institutions, and a tendency to resolve disagreements through dialogue. These characteristics, according to some authors, were reinforced by the passage of thousands of German soldiers through detention centres abroad. Although the repatriation marked the formal end of their prisoner status, the memory of that stage was maintained in different forms. In letters preserved by their descendants, in notes written in personal notebooks, or in sporadic conversations with neighbours. It was not about reliving the past, but about registering that for several years, part of their formation as adults occurred far from their country, in controlled but also unexpected conditions. The return was also a starting point. It allowed them to begin reconstructing what was lost, and at the same time introduce into their environment certain ideas that, although they did not come to be imposed, began to circulate discreetly. The memory of their time in the United States was neither uniform nor always positive, but it contributed to delineating one of the many layers of post-war Germany. In that intermediate space between defeat and reconstruction, the experience accumulated in captivity found ways to make itself present, without speeches or proclamations, but with visible effects over time.